Hi there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about another retrospective here. The debut album from The Neighbourhood, titled I Love You. Now, a few weeks ago, the video game series Extra Credits made an episode about a growing problem in film and in video games, something called spectacle creep. Now, to boil the principle down, this is a belief that blockbuster movies and games have to become more and more extravagant and epic with each installment in order to keep the audience's interest. And after a certain point, you're gonna hit a brick wall because there's only so much you can ramp up the epicness before everything starts getting insanely ridiculous. The sad thing is that I don't think the Extra Credits guys went far enough with their hypothesis, because I'm here to tell you that the same concept is starting to become true in music as well, particularly pop music in the past few years. Now, most of the credit/blame for this can be placed at the feet of the rising EDM scene, where elements seeking to drive the strongest emotional reaction must be continuous crescendo. You find this in some dubstep fans, always hunting for the biggest drop, for instance. It's the rise of raw, grandiose spectacle over substance, which is why this year there have been so many songs with these very heavy backbeats and pounding percussion that oftentimes totally eclipses the lead singer in that mix over the instrumentation or the lyrical content. Now, let me state that, of course, this isn't the case for everybody. Several acts this year have managed to make those heavier beats work for them in a pop context, mostly by adopting a larger scale or a more invigorated sound in their delivery, or simply being able to match those beats with their own personality. But let's face facts, that requires an artist with distinctive personality and heft, and we don't always get those in today's modern pop scene. So, producers and songwriters who were desperate to leap on the bandwagon figured out the next best thing to get the songs to sound more potent and meaningful than they really were. Reverb and echo, letting the individual sounds build and echo throughout the mix to create that sonorous experience. But there can be problems with that approach, and to discuss these problems, we're going to take a look at the debut album from The Neighbourhood that came out earlier this year to some critical acceptance and my complete indifference. The album is a classic example of how trying to make music sound bigger and more impressive ultimately highlights the serious weaknesses of the act and ultimately renders their album a lot worse than it probably would have otherwise been branded. Now, don't get me wrong, this album is pretty damn mediocre and insufferable all the same, but the poor production choices pushes this album towards bad in a very big way. Now, first, let me get the few compliments I have towards this band out of the way quickly. The production, at its best, it has a certain grandiose spaciousness to which I'm rather fond. Sure, it's painfully derivative of Snow Patrol and especially Arcade Fire, but I'm not gonna lie and argue against a good sound that I like even when it's not being used effectively. And you know, there are occasionally these little snippets of wit and some decent technical songwriting that crop up on this album that show that somewhere in the live journal, the middle-aged girl they cribbed these lyrics from might be a decent songwriter someday. Who knows? And you know what? To be fair, you can tell that The Neighbourhood is drawing from a good pool of references when it comes to their sound. Now, the band they've clearly drawn the most influence from is Arcade Fire, except where that band had memorable melodies and a real presence behind the microphone, this band has a load of reverb, a vocalist somewhere between late period Alex Turner and the guys from Blood on the Dance Floor, and not a single memorable melody line conveyed through their instrumentation in the slightest. I've listened to this album a number of times over the past few weeks, and I cannot tell you a single memorable hook or melody on this album. And when you start off having to deal with that, you end up in big trouble because all that reverb and all of that spacious production only serves to emphasize how empty the rest of melody the rest of these tracks really are. Maybe if the reverb was peeled back a little bit, could have been described as maybe minimalist, I don't know. But this album is aiming for broad, sweeping, grandiose hammering that can only just induce migraines. The most positive I can say about the instrumentation is that the guitar does have a good tone, and I liked hearing it whenever it popped in, although it was never allowed to gain any swell or any presence or serve as anything besides instrumental punctuation, and to me that's a real waste of some good talent. Now, the band that I was ultimately and immediately reminded of, in fact, when I was listening through this album, is one that I often mentally paired with The Neighbourhood in my mind before listening to or reviewing either album, which is, of course, Bastille. Now, I'll admit that back when I reviewed that album, Bad Blood, I was probably a little hard on Bastille, and I've warmed very slightly to that album since then. But man, I Love You by The Neighbourhood really seeks to cast Bastille in a favorable light. Say what you will about both acts' dourness and occasionally sour lyrics that just set me on a bad edge, but at least Bastille had a vocalist who could deliver his songs with some presence and potence and energy, and who can match his production. Here, vocalist Jesse Rutherford is often swallowed up under his own reverb, half because he never really sounds like he's trying all that effectively, and half because his range is painfully limited. He's clearly trying to convey some emotion, but throughout his songs are so buried in the mix that they just come across as, where they could come across as emotionally potent, they come across as rather muted and not all that distinctive. And here's where this becomes a big problem: the lyrics. Now, look, the technical songwriting, it's mostly passable, but the content here is the big glowing red weak spot for The Neighbourhood. Simply put, by the end of this record, Jesse Rutherford manages to completely destroy any possible goodwill he might have with me because he is astoundingly pissy on this album. And we're not talking about the straightforward bawling that we got from Linkin Park's circa Hybrid Theory, but an overload of this passive-aggressive whinging and bitching about a failed relationship when you quickly realize that the title of this album, I Love You, it has to be ironic. And you know, I could skate all around this all day, but you know what? Let's cut to the chase and call this what it is. This album is emo 2013. Now, unlike most, I'm not the sort of critic who's one to condemn the entire genre of emo as garbage, because with acts like Say Anything, that's just not true. But The Neighbourhood sure as hell brings the worst traits of it to the forefront on this album. The passive-aggressiveness, the self-loathing, the omnipresent smug, whining tone of every single song. Only on an emo record would you get lyrics like, "You're a doll, you're flawless, but I just can't wait for love to destroy us." Yeah, that's what we're dealing with here. But look, as I said, emo doesn't equal bad. The problem here is in the execution and in the production. Emo can work with good songwriting, which is kind of lacking in flavor and impact on this album, and with good delivery, which, as I said, there's no good delivery here. But the problem is that any of those emotions, any few emotions that we would try to get from this album are leached of any real raw feeling by the production blowing them up with reverb, making them sound portentous and deep. And really, they really aren't. If anything, the production just blows up the sour pissiness of the lyrics to insufferable proportions. And worse still, Jesse Rutherford's delivery does not convince me that any of these emotions are coming from a remotely sympathetic place. I don't identify with this guy at all. I have a hard time buying into the fact that he feels these emotions with his particular vocal delivery. And even if he does, the songs are still too sullen, miserable, and ultimately completely uninteresting to make any sort of impact with me. Look, I'm sorry. In the end, I cannot recommend I Love You by The Neighbourhood. It's whiny, it's pretentious as all hell, and it's really rather dull after repeated listens. It didn't stick with me whatsoever, and that's one of the reasons why this review is so late, and frankly, the only reason I'm covering it at all instead of ignoring it is because of requests from you guys. But on the other hand, I can accept this album might not be targeted at me. For the sullen teenage demographic who find detachment and dour seriousness a virtue or something comforting for them to combat their inner turmoil, this album, it might fit the bill. But on the other hand, there are just so many better acts who have come out this year that are analogous in the same vein to The Neighbourhood sound and just do it better. Sure, the 1975 might be too upbeat, but both Bastille and Jimmy Eat World dropped better albums this year than The Neighbourhood did, with the exact same theme, and they did it a fair amount better. Now, look, I can't really recommend either Damage or Bad Blood, but look, they're better than this, and it's getting a 4 out of 10 from me. Skip this album, folks, and maybe somebody in their production booth will clue into the fact that this sort of overloaded, percussion-heavy reverb production only really works and only really it feels epic when there's substance behind it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's any other albums you'd like me to take a look at, or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. So until then, see you next time.